Hello, everyone. My name is Jarod Reyes, and I am privileged to serve on the developer education team at Twilio. And the developer education team is part of the developer network at Twilio, but our job is to handle the docs. And today, I want to tell you a little bit about the journey that led me to believe that we who write documentation would be better served getting out of the way of developers and letting them get back to work quicker. And how by listening and watching developers consume Twilio docs, we were able to improve developer experience at Twilio overall. There's an inherent disconnect between the docs that we need as developers and the docs that we write. And today I'd love to tell you a little bit about how we put code first in our documentation and give you some tools that might help you improve your product and your documentation. But first, I'd like to tell you a little story. I'm a father of a 2-year-old, Elliot. He's right there clapping incessantly for me. He's a good fan. And that means for the first time in my life, I am terrified of everything. Because everything is terrifying. Like, there are rivers to walk into, streets to walk into, bicyclists to walk into. I mean, he just doesn't stop walking. So there's a lot to walk into, which means that even though I was totally fine with my house not having a front fence for many years, as soon as I had a 2-year-old that just wanted to run into the street constantly, I decided I needed to build a fence. And so I did build a fence, all by myself. But I'm a developer, and in San Diego at least, developers don't really do fences. At Portland, it's probably less true than in San Diego. Everyone here is more than able to cut down a tree, I'm sure. But I had no idea where to start. So I knew where the information was, and that was the library. So I went to the library. I checked out a book on carpentry. I read chapter 1, What is Carpentry? Chapter 2, The Basics of Woodworking. Chapter 3, Framing and Joints. Chapter 4, Getting the Tools You Need. And finally, Chapter 5, Your First Project, A Simple Fence for the Overworried Parent of a Toddler. No, I totally did not do that, of course. I did what any modern dad would do. I Googled it. And when I Googled it, I found a YouTube video that was created by a carpenter who had been doing it for 35 years. He had read that book, he had read every book, and he put together a YouTube video that with step-by-step instructions told me every item I needed to buy in order to build this fence. And lo and behold, 36 hours later, I had built a fence to keep my baby safe. And because when faced with the challenge of doing something I didn't know, of building a fence, I had gone with the fastest route possible to get the information I needed. There's actually a term for this. It's called information foraging. And information foraging is a theory that says humans have evolved for millennia to be able to quickly identify a patch of land, an area, and decide whether it was resource rich or not. We quickly decide whether or not we should make camp here and get as much food and resources as possible, or whether or not we should keep moving and look for a better place to find resources. And we do this all the time on the web. The theory comes from observing user behavior and saying people do the same thing when they visit a web page. They immediately look for the information sent. And they try to see, does this page smell like it has the information that I need on it? And over the last 2 years of building docs at Twilio, I have come to believe that there is no better population at foraging information on the web than the developer. And I'm going to tell you how we figured that out and the data that led us down that path. And it all started with assembling a ragtag bunch of crew called the Developer Education Team. 2 years ago, I was at Write the Docs over at the Crystal Ballroom, another awesome conference, and I got a call from someone at Twilio that said, "Hey, we're gonna really double down on docs. We're gonna make this a team. Like, we're actually gonna put people, developers, in seats and actually build new documentation." And the mission of that crew was to find new ways to educate developers and to improve documentation. If you're like me at that point, like, documentation was an afterthought. Like, we built stuff. I was out, on the road doing demos and working on blog posts and doing fun hacks with Arduinos. Documentation was definitely an afterthought, and it was kind of owned by everyone at Twilio. It was owned by the API team, the R&D teams, the product managers. There was no single team that owned it. Because in reality, like, people like their documentation. I've heard from people at this conference that, like, Twilio documentation is good. I don't agree necessarily anymore because I've had to work on it for 2 years, but I do think it's getting better. And I think the thing that that led us to think it was good was that we could get the information. If we put enough time into it, there was accurate information and code samples telling us how to do it. But when I got this mandate and started this new team, I said, well, how are people actually using this? Is it really good? Is it really easy to use? So we took a look at the docs. This is the docs in 2013. I don't know if you remember this. But it has, a simple index page. It has all the content types on it. It's got quick starts, how-tos, helper libraries across the top. And people were using this. They were using it, all right, but I wanted to know exactly how they were using it. So we looked at the data, and we looked at the usefulness of each section of docs. And we defined usefulness by the traffic that those pages were getting, the time on page, and the bounce rate. So we're looking for a low bounce rate and a high in the other two categories. And the API reference was the winner by far. Like, people were spending time here, they were getting usefulness from it. It was a great little section. Right behind it was the quick starts. And right away, you can start to see that the developers that were being served best were the developers that were just trying to get something done quickly or just exploring Twilio. Doing a quick start is kind of like, am I going to use this? Is this something I want to play with? But there was one section that we were ignoring quite a bit, and that was the developer who actually needs to build something real for their company. And these were what the how-tos were doing. These were supposed to tell you how to build mass numbers if you're an Airbnb developer, or how to do click-to-call if you're a real estate management company, or how to do SMS notifications for all the developers that wanted to know when their server went down. And these were really, really performing badly. We had a huge bounce rate, we had a low time on page, and we had no traffic at all. And this makes sense, because we weren't putting the effort into figuring out what and how to serve documentation. We were just writing it and putting it out there. But intuitively, we had another hunch. We had a hunch that aside from one area of developers not being served well, we were actually interrupting the developer's workflow quite a bit across all of the documentation. We weren't doing a good job of finding ways to fit into the developer workflow. And this was a hunch. We hadn't proved it yet. But we thought, if we get the chance, we're going to test this out and see if we can create a better workflow for developers. Because we had been taking the tried and true approach of taking our product and writing a big book about it and dumping it in front of the developer. And this is totally how we thought about it. We're like, we have a product. We're going to tell you how it's useful to your business. We're going to tell you exactly what this API method does, all the parameters that you can, play with. And we were just writing the story. We're writing the narrative. And this makes sense, right? Because humans have evolved to learn in stories. We actually codify knowledge in paragraphs and sentences, we now know, which means that we're actually retaining information as story, as narrative, and we're pulling it back from memory as story and narrative. And you can see this all the way back from cave paintings to published books. But there's a new language that we're all working in every day, and that's code. And code, it turns out, is its own story. I'll talk about more of that in a bit. But the problem with writing the big book of documentation and having that be the source of truth is that developers don't have time to read. We're too busy scoring points, making user stories, upvoting our friends on Hacker News to take the time and read someone's beautiful written prose about their documentation. And this, we immediately saw this in the data. What we did is we took a look at the sentences before a code sample on any page on Twilio docs, and we compared that to the traffic that page got, and it was pretty stark. If there were more than 11 sentences before a code sample, we had very low traffic. By simply reducing that to 5 to 10 sentences before a code sample, we saw double the traffic. And by reducing that to less than 4 sentences before a code sample, if the code sample was above the fold and there was only a few words before it, we saw 5 to 10x better performance. And this was without doing anything. We just kind of looked at the data and we were like, what's going on? Like, why are these performing so poorly, these certain pages? And across the board, it was how quickly can a developer get to code, which is confusing, right? Because they're not looking at, the prose around the code. They're just immediately going to the code. But it wasn't just true for that single page. It was affecting the entire session. So if we had more than 11 sentences, we saw session lengths and pages per session that were lower than its comrades. And again, if there was less than 4 sentences, we saw crazy long session lengths. We're talking 16, 20 minutes sometimes. So we had a problem, and we knew it. We were underserving one population of developers, and developers wanted to get code. They wanted to go straight to code. So we thought, time to experiment. Time to do that time to prove that hunch we had, which is that we are very much in the way of the developer's workflow. So we had a hypothesis. Developers want to see code quickly, we know this, but my hypothesis is the best way the developers are going to learn is by having someone walk through the code with them. Because we've all had those moments at hackathons while we're in school, just hanging out upstairs, where someone comes up to you, they look at your code, they're like, hey, have you tried this? Or you walk up to someone and you're like, hey, what are you working on? They're like, oh, I'm doing this. That, for whatever reason, that turns out to be one of the fastest ways we learn how to do anything with code. So we're like, how can we turn that into something like a product? So, lest you think this whole story is like all success and first time wins, we took a stab at that, and this is what it looked like. It was interesting. We spent a lot of time building this prototype, and the goal was create a sample app, an entire sample app that you could deploy to Heroku with one click, that a developer could then just come on the Twilio docs and walk through the entire code base. We could explain exactly what the controller was doing, what the model was doing, how to render the views. We could talk about databases. We could talk about getting ngrok set up, and we did. Like we just took the code and we annotated it and we threw it up in this little IDE experience. And we had spent so much time on this that when we looked at the user tests and we actually looked at the videos of how people were using it, they had no idea where to start. Which is, just a reminder, like, you may have a hunch and you may go to prove it and you may be very, very heartily disappointed in the way people use it. But that information was so valuable. We saw people immediately scroll to the code. We saw them skip the 5 sentences of introductory prose and go immediately to the code, start poking around, and they were like, I don't know what this is. Like, the code's super tiny. It's not an IDE that I recognize. I don't know what you guys are trying to do. But we did see, we saw the beginnings, the inkling of a product that we thought maybe would turn developers into avid users of this. So we took try two, and we took away the control. We made it less about you can go wherever you want, and we made it a step-by-step tutorial. So now you could click right, and you could click next, and you could see every single snippet of code and its annotation. But we also did this nifty little thing, which we still couldn't get out of the way of ourselves. We had to have some representation of our beautiful minds, so we put this little progress bar across the top. And you're probably thinking what every other user thought, what the F is that? And what it is, in our minds, was you need to know what part of the application you're looking at. Is this the controller? Is this the server integration? Is this the front end? But people didn't know what the icons meant. People didn't know why this thing was up there. Is it a scroll bar? Is it navigation? It turned out to be both. But we again got feedback. I don't know what this scroll bar is, but I do know how to use this now. I can go left and right, I can go forward and backward, and I can interact with this file explorer all I want. Couple problems. Why do you have the important prose on the right-hand side of the page? That's weird. And this file explorer looks nothing like my Vim, my Sublime, my Eclipse. It looks nothing like any file explorer I've ever seen. You guys need to work on that. And again, just by watching the developers, we were getting all this feedback. We'd ask them things, and they'd be like, yeah, it's great. We love it. It's perfect. But we'd watch them, and they'd be like, click, 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 weird, weird, weird look, not know what they're doing. And it was really important to watch those videos because we were getting all that information. So we heard that this was weird. We heard that this was weird. And so we said, let's create the last and final version. We didn't know it was going to be the last and final version, but March of this year, we launched these. And we watched the user tests, and everything was shaping up really nicely. So we launched these. We heard a lot of feedback from you and everyone in the community that this was something new, and it was exciting. But we weren't confident until we looked at the data. So we looked at the click-to-call tutorial, and we looked at its traffic week over week and year over year and month over month to see if it was actually doing better as far as engagement. It might have more users because we were promoting it, but does it have better engagement? So sure enough, it had 3x the amount of users. It had double the session length, and it had 3 times the pages per session, which was telling us that this was the gateway that we were finally getting these developers who actually need to build something into the Twilio docs. And we were seeing a ton of engagement and a ton of positivity. And we now had proved our hunch that if we get code first and we get out of the way, we write less and less words, we're gonna capture developers. And we found this amazing little bit of data, which was that. I'm going to go back real quick. That screen right here, if that first code snippet was more than 20 lines of code, we saw our engagement plummet. We saw time on page plummet, and we saw people bounce a lot more. But if we reduced just that simple first line of code, we were getting a lot more engagement, which was counterintuitive to what we'd learned. We'd learned that like developers want code, so give them lots of code. But it turns out that when they are entering experience, they just still want to feel a little bit more comfortable. Like if I dump you straight into a bunch of Java and you're a Node developer, you're like, what the F am I looking at? So that was super important information I just want to share because I forgot to put it in the slides. But the learning didn't stop there. We were able to implement metrics using Mixpanel that allowed us to learn from our developers every single day. So by looking at use case popularity, sorry about the tiny font, but these are use cases. So SMS notifications for servers, appointment reminders, click to call, they're all on here. And by tracking this, we're able to learn from our developers what are the use cases that are important to you? What are you implementing the most? And so we can move them around in the UI. We can prioritize more content for them. And we can, if we hear from developers that the SMS appointment reminders is the best tutorial out there and we see it, then we might start emulating it a lot more when we're writing new tutorials. There's another thing we were tracking, which is language. And by tracking the language, this gave us a very interesting, the completion rate in the language, this gives us a very interesting matrix to plot our authors by. Because we are a team of 4 right now, and there's about 10 people creating content for Twilio docs. And every single one of us is a developer, but we all have different language specialties. So I'm a Ruby guy, Kevin's a Node guy, Andrew's a Python guy, and we all write different kinds of tutorials. But by following the completion rate, we're able to see that PHP is way outperforming Python, so we should have our PHP guy talk to Andrew or Nikita and give them some pointers. Cool. So I'm at a Node conf, so come on. We have to do demo time. So what we actually built in order to make sure that the authoring experience was the same for all of our authors, and also something that they could just install quickly with npm. We built a little package called Thesaurus that is a generator for our tutorials. So it creates a static asset that we can then upload to twilio.com, or we can turn it into a GitHub tutorial. So the way it works is you enter into terminal, and you install Thesaurus. Just do npm install. I think it's still private. Right now, if I want to create a tutorial, I would do source new. Oh, thank you. Command F1. Command F1. Command function F1. There we go. So by typing source new, I created a new tutorial file. And if I actually go into Sublime, I can see that indeed I have a tutorial file now. And in there, I have a config file, which just I can tell it some things about my little tutorial. And this is at jarod reyes/viewsource. And now I have a Jade file that this is what's going to actually render the or generate the templates. So Viewsource is going to parse this Jade file, which we can use Jade or we can use Markdown. By just doing source new, we have this template file to work from. So now I have a template file, and it's already all ready to go if I want to just check out what I've been created. So I can write source author, and now I can go to localhost 8080. Spoiler. And I have this nifty little tutorial, which shows a config file on the right and steps on the left. If I want to edit this, I just go into the Jade file that I was just in, and I add another step. And again, this can be Markdown, it can be Jade, and here I've kind of interplayed the both of them. And again, you can imagine that this is just doing a lot of parsing and file system munging to create these static assets. But what I really want to show you is that once I have this tutorial that I like, I can now just deploy it to GH pages. Oh, and I added a highlight tag so that I can highlight this little bit of code showing the author command, the CLI there, that actually loads in the commands that are just node modules. So if I go in here and I added a step for node PDX. Ooh. And I get push. Oh, get checkout. GH pages. Cool, then I'll just check that out. You can see where this is going to go. But should have checked out the branch before I committed. Now I have Thesaurus live as a GitHub tutorial. So now you can imagine creating something at this conference that you want to share with people, you want to educate on. Maybe it's something your own team's going to use, some tooling. You can create a tutorial. You can then upload it to GH Pages, and you have a live tutorial that then highlights the code that you want to talk about. So that is something that we're actively working on getting available to you guys because we think it's a tool that's going to make the developer experience better. But to go back to this story, we had... Sorry, I'm still Command F1. There we go. We had proven the thesis. Put code first, get out of the developer's way, and good things will happen. We had turned this experience, which was lots of scrolling and also a zip file as opposed to a GitHub checkout, and we turned it into this experience. And we knew that we had to do this for the entire documentation. So we took some time, we reflected on what was valuable, and we said, you know, we might have proven that code needs to be first, but we have done nothing to really get out of the way of the developer's workflow. So we actually sat down and we did a bunch of developer interviews, and we asked, you know, what are the things that hinder you from getting back into your flow? And they're like, well, you know, pretty much anything that I have to do that's outside of like my core ticket that I'm working on is really a distraction. We said, well, what would help? And they're like, well, things that would help would be like, I don't know, using my IDE or making it seem like I'm using my IDE, you know, making it easier for me to kind of work in a two-window mode. And so we said, okay, let's get rid of this, and let's create something that's responsive and something that has a little bit better information hierarchy so they're not having to click their way through our docs. Maybe add some search. And so a couple weeks ago, indeed, we did. And now I would love to show you our new docs, if you just permit me a couple minutes. So now we have new documentation, and right off the bat, you'll notice that it's slightly different styled. And that's on purpose. We actually have a much simpler hierarchy now. That whole right nav that was just like a big bag of doorknobs, that's gone. And we now have filtering. So if you're a developer who primarily does voice, you can click on voice. If you know you're going to be writing in Node.js, click Node.js. And now only the tutorials that are in those languages are going to show up. So now you can go learn how to do automated surveys, how Trump's doing automatic dialing. And you can now take a tutorial. But there's a couple other things that we did. We implemented search, so I can do send message with image. And I know it's like not novel to have search documentation, but we know that when developers were using our site before, they were coming from Google. They were searching on Stack Overflow and Google to get to our docs. And the one thing that we don't have control over is how Google actually shows, hope I'm connected to the internet right now, how Google shows the search results. But we have total control over this now, right? So we can, in the search result, we can show code samples. Any minute. So yeah, we can show code samples in our search results. So now when I do send a message with an image, because I clicked Node.js on that homepage, I now get a Node.js sample of how to send an MMS. And we're getting the developer right back to work. They wanted to find something, they can click and copy it here. The other thing we're doing is that this is now responsive. So if I'm in Eclipse or Visual Studio, I can move this over to the right and have my code samples right next to me while I'm coding. And then the other thing that we listened to was, you know, being able to switch themes. So now you can switch from light to dark theme and get code samples and a little bit closer to the world and the light economy that you're actually working in. So we made some changes with the goal of getting out of the developer's way. Please send me any notes on any of the stuff you've seen today. Let me know how it would be easier for you to have us get out of your way, how you would like to work with documentation. You know, would a command line interface be valuable? Would a REST API for our docs be valuable? Those are the kind of things that we would really love to hear because we can prioritize those and build those. So just to recap, we had done the big book approach. We wrote a nice flowery documentation about why the product was important to you and your customers, how to use it, and this wasn't valuable. So we realized you didn't have time to read and that you wanted to see the code. So we got you into the code. And more importantly, we tried to innovate in ways that would make your job a lot easier and get you back to work. But we're nowhere near done, and I'm hoping that today you guys all leave with a sense of being able to think about how your documentation, how your tooling, how the things you're building for your customers and for your teammates could be improved by getting out of each other's way and putting code first. And really thinking about code being the narrative that you're talking about. I've seen every single presentation has done this. And I think we all intuitively know it, but there's an inherent disconnect between the docs that we need and the docs we write. And I hope that we can all improve this together. Because I know that there's a lot more important things that we should all be doing and that developers are doing other than reading our documentation, like protecting your babies from traffic. So thank you all very much. This is a beautiful conference and a beautiful city, and thank you for having me. It was wonderful.